The top 10 is really, really hard, obviously. I know, thank you, YouTuber of the year with this shit. But additionally, it does seem like a lot of the hardest levels in the game are not very enjoyable. Now, to some extent, this has always kind of been the case. Beating something really, really difficult is going to be less enjoyable than something that is around your skill level that you don't necessarily need to push yourself for. There are a few levels in the top 10, especially in the top 5, that seem to be rather lacking in their number of victors and people who have progress on the levels, likely because they are both really, really difficult and also not very enjoyable. For example, the only character victor of Amethyst, Zoink, has stated multiple times that Amethyst is absolutely insufferable to play. And while Tidal Wave, as the number 3 hardest level in the game, has a handful of victors, none of those victors have gone for Nullscapes or Boobawamba. Actually, Nullscapes and Boobawamba do not have any victors, and Nullscape specifically has been out for about a year now. The levels in the top 10 with the most victors tend to be the oldest levels in the top 10, and usually are reportedly somewhat enjoyable, varying extents, like Tidal Wave or Andromeda. So why is it that levels that have recently entered the top 10 are not being completed by nearly as many players who have the skill to do so, or at least the potential to? Just focusing on the top 10 for the purposes of this video. Several of the levels in the top 10 were actively super buffed in order to push further placement on the list. And generally speaking, the levels that were super buffed in order to be a certain difficulty range on the demon list tend to not be as enjoyable for the people who play them. For example, Zoink's version of Acheron that was verified is much harder than the other potential versions of the level for being verified by other players in order for Acheron to be the hardest level in the game. Specifically to be harder than Slaughterhouse, as Slaughterhouse was controversially replaced above Sakupin Circles and Abyss of Darkness. Avernus was also buffed to be top 1 with some controversial hitbox choices, and after a few months at the number 2 spot was swapped with Acheron to be considered the hardest level in the game going into 2.2. Tidal Wave was also buffed, however its longer length makes it more accessible even if many people do not find it enjoyable to actually beat. Additionally, Nullscapes was super buffed by Zoink to be much more difficult and ended up placing at number 2, but it also has a CBF blocker. Which, speaking of, the second reason some of the top levels are pretty unenjoyable has to do with CBF blockers. Their janky implementation and RobTop's refusal to do anything ever. Zoink did cite the CBF blocking in Amethyst to be particularly frustrating, and part of the reason why it was so unenjoyable. Specifically, the first click was aligned to be much more difficult on CBF than without using CBF, but later more measures were put in place by Popoff to make sure that you could not beat the level with clicks between frames. Thinking Space 2 and Nullscapes also have CBF blockers, meaning that if someone uses the clicks between frames mod to make the 2.2 physics of the game a little more enjoyable for themselves, which is accepted for list records, going for any of these levels would be much more of a challenge. Not necessarily in terms of difficulty, but in terms of like how much you want to pull your eyes out, like enjoyability. Super buffing levels and use of CBF blockers aren't alone the reason why the top 10 is probably much more unenjoyable than in previous years. There's also the fact that levels like Silent Clubstep just suck to play, because impossible levels were not actually ever meant to be played, so they're all going to play terribly. However, it should be noted that levels that weren't super buffed tend to have less hate from the people that play them, even if their experiences weren't always overall positive, considering how many top 10 completions are a new hardest by far. So what could be done to address any of this? Well, firstly, we could stop buffing new projects to be top 1. This doesn't have to be a ride or die rule, it's not going to make sense for all levels. For example, Grief would have never been playable, honestly, at any difficulty, and Doggy spent way too much time for him to go back. Additionally, it's possible that longer levels like Flame Wall won't have this issue to the same extent because their longer difficulty might make it more accessible to different players, meaning that they might tend to at least attempt going for the level. But for a lot of upcoming extreme demons that are aimed to be in the top 1 range, or even just the top 5 range, there's an ongoing trend for years now where a level that is meant to be top 1 has to repeatedly be buffed to keep up with the new top 1s that keep coming out that are obviously harder and harder, meaning that we stray further and further away from the original vision for the level, at least gameplay wise. So maybe it would make more sense for these levels to be anywhere from top 5 to top 20, partially to help fill the difficulty gaps between the top levels as they are much vaster than the difficulty gaps lower on the list. But also because if, for example, a level was made to be harder than Slaughterhouse but wasn't finished finished until today, which would make it like, I don't know, like top 10-ish. It might be more enjoyable for a level and receive more praise if it was just kept at the top 10 difficulty range instead of super buffed to be harder than Amethyst. An example of this happening in the past would be Zodiac versus Kinos. Lepesta has said that Kinos wasn't meant to be top 1 necessarily in his unfiltered convo with Secret Way, which is a great video if you have 3 hours of spare time. But this would also help give top players more choices or stepping stones to beat harder levels, giving them more enjoyable levels to play at the top difficulty to help hone their skills with a level that isn't completely insufferable. I think this could have applied to several levels like Amethyst, Nullscapes, and Boobawamba. Amethyst was originally inspired by the Golden and meant to be a top 1 in an era marked by the dethroning of Tartarus, and honestly could have been much more enjoyable as something that would be around top 20 difficulty today. And while Nullscapes and Boobawamba are much more recent levels, they could have definitely aimed for a slightly lower spot on the list in favor of being a level that serves to help players reach the top of the list. This could still apply to levels like Vehemence, which have received heavy buffing in order to compete with levels like Amethyst. Not to mention that the cycle will probably continue considering that Flame Wall looks like it's about to be verified, and given that Pop-Off plays Vehemence about once a year, Brief will probably also be released before then. So as simple as it sounds, just don't buff the levels. Blocking the use of the click between frames mod is not necessarily something that the community can fix by itself. It has been over a year since RobTob first teased the idea of making his own version of the clicks between frames mod. Honestly, I think the closest thing to a resolution that we'll get regarding that will probably just be the Rated Plus tab, which will genuinely be a really good improvement. None of this has been to say that this is the only thing or the perfect thing to happen in order to make the top levels more enjoyable. It's more of just a thought experiment of mine to try to figure out something that could potentially lead to more victors of the top levels. In all fairness, there is a very specific group of people who are capable of taking the game farther. We've reached a level of difficulty to the point where almost no one will want to dedicate that much time to pushing the difficulty ceiling because playing the evil-ass torture level for 400,000 attempts is just not going to be appealing to very many people. So, in theory, it would be nice if the evil-ass torture level was slightly less torturous and there were more levels to choose from. I also want to say that none of this is to send any hate towards any of the top players or any of the creators. At the end of the day, we are talking about levels that only like 0.001% of the community are capable of playing. But top play is very inspiring to a lot of players, and I think it could be beneficial for more levels to be made with this in mind. Obviously, the 2.2 physics changes have done their damage, and the clicks between frames debate is just, like, ever-evolving. It hinges on the idea of RobTop doing anything, which just doesn't happen. Remember, 2.3, not 2.21. 2.3 was supposed to be out 6 months after 2.2, so it makes sense that there would be more drama and less activity, but I figured it'd at least be worth a shot to document some of the thoughts I had in a video. Thank you all so much for watching me yap about hard levels in a game. If you did enjoy, please remember to subscribe because it would be cool. Whatever. Let me know in the comments what you think could be done to make the top 10 more enjoyable, or if it even needs to happen, and whether or not Cuatro Cientos got 99 a third time, or if we verified. I mean, this might actually just release after Flame Wall is verified. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all again in the next one. Stay safe, everyone.